In the quiet suburbs of Cedar Falls, Iowa, where white picket fences and well-manicured lawns spoke of American dreams fulfilled and families living in peaceful prosperity, there stood in the year 1962 a modest two-story house that would become the center of one of the most disturbing cases of psychological denial and macabre family dysfunction in modern American history. The Hartwell family, Thomas, Margaret, and their teenage daughter Sarah, had lived at 42 Maple Street for more than a decade, maintaining the facade of suburban normalcy while harboring within their home a secret so horrific that when it was finally discovered, it would challenge every assumption about the nature of grief, family bonds, and the lengths to which loving parents might go to avoid accepting the unacceptable reality of their child's death. The tragedy that would ultimately destroy the Hartwell family began on a crisp October morning in 1958, when their beloved son Michael, just 12 years old, collapsed while playing in the backyard and died suddenly from what the family doctor would later determine was an undiagnosed heart condition. Michael had been the golden child of the Hartwell household, bright, athletic, charming, and possessed of the kind of infectious enthusiasm that made him beloved not just by his parents and sister, but by neighbors, teachers, and classmates throughout their small community. For Thomas and Margaret Hartwell, both in their early 40s and having struggled for years with fertility issues before Michael's birth, their son represented not just their greatest joy, but their primary reason for existence. Thomas, a mild-mannered insurance adjuster who had never distinguished himself in any particular way, found in Michael's achievements the success and recognition that had always eluded him in his own life. Margaret, who had abandoned her teaching career to devote herself entirely to motherhood, poured all of her frustrated intellectual energy and maternal instincts into nurturing what she believed would be an extraordinary human being who would justify every sacrifice she had made. The sudden death of this perfect child, this repository of all their hopes and dreams, struck the Hartwell parents with a force that seemed to shatter their capacity for rational thought. Rather than accepting the devastating reality of their loss and beginning the painful process of grief and healing, Thomas and Margaret made a decision that would transform their family into something that existed outside the boundaries of normal human experience. They decided that Michael was not really dead, that what had occurred was merely a temporary setback that could be overcome through proper care and unwavering faith in his eventual recovery. This delusion, born from love too intense to accept loss and denial too complete to acknowledge reality, became the foundation for 4 years of increasingly bizarre behavior that would isolate the family from their community while creating a household that functioned according to rules that no outside observer could comprehend or accept. The immediate aftermath of Michael's death saw the Hartwell family withdraw from all social contact, declining offers of sympathy and support from neighbors while canceling the funeral arrangements that had been tentatively planned. When questioned about these decisions, Thomas and Margaret explained that Michael was merely very ill and required complete rest and privacy during his recovery period. They spoke of consulting with specialists and pursuing experimental treatments that required isolation from potential sources of infection or disturbance. Dr. William Morrison, the family physician who had pronounced Michael dead and who had offered to help with funeral arrangements, found his attempts to provide medical guidance politely but firmly rebuffed. The Hartwells claimed to have transferred Michael's care to specialists in Chicago, providing vague references to innovative treatments and promising updates on his condition that never materialized. When Dr. Morrison attempted to follow up on these claims, he discovered that no such specialists existed and that the supposed medical facilities his former patients referenced were fictional. But the doctor's concerns were dismissed by local authorities, who saw no evidence of criminal activity and who were reluctant to interfere in what appeared to be a family's private struggle with medical issues and grief. The Hartwells continued to pay their bills, maintain their property, and avoid any behavior that would justify official intervention, while their explanation for their son's absence from school was accepted without question by administrators who assumed the family was dealing with a serious illness that required extended treatment. Sarah Hartwell, who had been 14 at the time of her brother's death, found herself trapped in a nightmare that combined genuine grief for her lost sibling with growing terror at her parents' increasingly delusional behavior. As the days turned to weeks and the weeks to months, she watched her mother and father construct an elaborate fantasy in which Michael remained a living member of their household, requiring care and attention that became more complex and demanding with each passing day. Margaret established a routine of bringing meals to Michael's room 3 times daily, spending hours at his bedside, reading aloud from his favorite books, and maintaining one-sided conversations about school, friends, and family events. She changed his clothes regularly, brushed his hair, and spoke to neighbors about his slow but steady improvement under the expert care he was receiving. Thomas installed special equipment in Michael's room that he claimed was necessary for his son's treatment, while taking over household duties that allowed Margaret to devote herself entirely to nursing their invalid child. The preservation of Michael's body during this period was accomplished through methods that the family had apparently researched extensively, using techniques that combined elements of mortuary science with procedures that seemed designed to maintain the illusion of life rather than simply prevent decay. The bedroom where Michael's remains were kept was climate-controlled and filled with equipment that suggested medical treatment while actually serving to maintain the corpse in a condition that supported the family's denial of death. Chemical preservation agents were applied regularly, according to schedules that Thomas maintained with obsessive precision, while the body was positioned and manipulated in ways that created the appearance of natural sleep rather than death. Clothing was changed frequently to prevent deterioration, while makeup and other cosmetic techniques were employed to maintain skin tone and facial appearance that could support the illusion that Michael was merely resting during a prolonged illness. As we delve into this disturbing case of grief, transformed into grotesque denial, we must confront the terrible power of love when it refuses to accept loss and the lengths to which human beings will go to maintain comforting illusions rather than face unbearable realities. The story we're exploring forces us to examine the fine line between devotion and madness, and the ways in which the deepest forms of care can become indistinguishable from the most profound forms of cruelty. If you find yourself drawn to these investigations into the darkest corners of human psychology and family dysfunction, please share your thoughts in the comments below and join our community by subscribing to the channel. The maintenance of this macabre charade required the Hartwell family to develop increasingly sophisticated methods of deception that extended far beyond simple preservation of their son's remains. They created an elaborate system of lies and misdirection that enabled them to maintain their secret while continuing to function within their community in ways that aroused minimal suspicion or concern. Margaret became expert at deflecting questions about Michael's condition, providing updates that suggested gradual improvement while explaining his continued absence from public view through references to compromised immunity and doctor's orders for strict isolation. She spoke knowledgeably about medical procedures and treatments that she claimed to have researched extensively, demonstrating familiarity with specialized terminology that made her explanations sound credible to casual observers. Thomas, meanwhile, had modified their home's infrastructure to support what he described as the medical equipment necessary for Michael's care, installing additional electrical capacity and ventilation systems that he claimed were required by the specialized devices that were monitoring his son's vital signs and assisting with his recovery. These modifications actually served to maintain the environmental conditions necessary for corpse preservation, while providing explanations for unusual sounds and odors that might otherwise have aroused suspicion. The psychological toll of maintaining this elaborate deception was most apparent in Sarah, who found herself forced to participate in family rituals that became more disturbing and complex as time passed. She was required to spend time with her dead brother, engaging in conversations that her parents insisted were therapeutic for his recovery, while maintaining the pretense that she believed in his eventual return to health. Sarah's school performance suffered dramatically as the stress of living with her family's secret consumed her ability to concentrate on normal activities. Teachers noted her increasing withdrawal and erratic behavior, while classmates reported that she had become moody and unpredictable, sometimes speaking about her brother as if he were alive and healthy, while at other times seeming to forget his existence entirely. The teenager's attempts to seek help were frustrated by her parents' sophisticated system of monitoring and control, which ensured that any effort to reveal their secret would be detected and prevented before it could reach outside authorities. Thomas had installed listening devices throughout the house that allowed him to monitor all telephone conversations, while Margaret maintained constant supervision over Sarah's activities that made independent communication impossible. More disturbing was the evidence that Sarah was beginning to internalize her parents' delusions, showing signs of believing that Michael might actually be alive despite the evidence of her own senses. The psychological pressure of living in an environment where reality was systematically denied had begun to affect her own capacity for rational thought, creating symptoms that resembled the shared psychosis that had already consumed her parents. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a psychiatrist who would later evaluate the family after their secret was discovered, documented evidence of what she termed folie à famille, a form of shared delusion that had spread through the household like a psychological infection, distorting the perceptions and judgment of all family members in ways that made their collective fantasy seem more real than objective reality. The family had created a closed system of mutual reinforcement that made their delusion increasingly elaborate and resistant to external correction, Dr. Chen wrote in her analysis of the case. Each family member's participation in the fantasy validated the other's beliefs, while creating social pressure that made questioning the delusion psychologically dangerous for any individual family member. The breaking point that would ultimately expose the Hartwell family's secret came in 1962, when a minor household accident led to emergency responders entering their home and discovering evidence that forced them to investigate more thoroughly than the family's carefully constructed facade could withstand. Margaret had suffered a fall while carrying one of Michael's meals to his room, breaking her ankle and requiring immediate medical attention that could not be provided without bringing outsiders into the house. The paramedics who responded to the emergency call noted immediately that the house smelled of chemicals and preservation agents that seemed inconsistent with normal residential use, while the equipment visible in Michael's room appeared more suited to mortuary work than medical treatment. Their observations led to questions that the family could not answer satisfactorily, while Sarah's obvious distress and confused responses to inquiries about her brother's condition raised additional concerns about the household's stability. The investigation that followed began as a welfare check designed to ensure that Michael was receiving appropriate medical care, but quickly evolved into a criminal investigation when authorities realized that the supposed invalid had been dead for more than 4 years. The discovery of the preserved corpse in what had been maintained as a child's bedroom created a crime scene that challenged the experience and training of investigators who had never encountered anything comparable in their professional careers. Detective Robert Harrison, who led the investigation, documented evidence of systematic deception and corpse abuse that revealed the full scope of the family's psychological breakdown. "The scene we encountered defied rational explanation," he wrote in his official report. A deceased child had been maintained in a state that resembled sleep, surrounded by toys, books, and personal effects, arranged as if he might wake up at any moment and resume a normal life. The preservation techniques that the family had employed demonstrated knowledge of mortuary science that they could not have acquired through normal means, suggesting that Thomas and Margaret had spent considerable time researching methods of corpse preservation and had potentially consulted with professionals whose advice they had adapted for their own purposes. The sophistication of their methods indicated planning and preparation that extended far beyond spontaneous denial of death. Chemical analysis of substances found in Michael's room revealed the use of formaldehyde, preservatives, and other agents that were typically employed in professional embalming, though applied according to procedures that seemed designed to maintain the appearance of life rather than simply prevent decay. The body itself showed evidence of regular maintenance that included cleaning, positioning, and cosmetic treatment that had been conducted over a period of years. The interrogation of family members revealed the extent to which their shared delusion had distorted their perception of reality and their understanding of their own actions. Thomas and Margaret continued to insist that Michael was alive and that their treatment of him was appropriate medical care that would eventually result in his recovery. They spoke of improvements in his condition that they claimed to have observed, describing responses and interactions that existed only in their imagination. Sarah's testimony was the most heartbreaking aspect of the investigation, revealing a teenager whose psychological development had been warped by years of forced participation in her parents' macabre fantasy. She alternated between describing Michael as dead and speaking of him as if he were alive, demonstrating the complete confusion about reality that had resulted from prolonged exposure to her family's systematic denial of truth. "I know he's dead, but Mama says he's just sleeping," Sarah told investigators during one interview. "Sometimes I think I see him move or hear him breathing, but I know that's not real. But Mama and Daddy say it is real, and they love him so much that maybe they're right and I'm wrong. I don't know what's true anymore." The psychiatric evaluation of the family revealed levels of psychological damage that would require years of treatment to address, while raising questions about whether complete recovery would ever be possible for individuals whose grasp on reality had been so thoroughly compromised. The shared nature of their delusion had created reinforcement patterns that made individual healing difficult, while requiring therapeutic approaches that could address both family dynamics and individual pathology. The legal proceedings that followed the discovery were complicated by questions about criminal intent and mental competency that challenged conventional approaches to prosecution and sentencing. While the family had clearly violated laws regarding proper disposition of human remains and child welfare, their actions had been motivated by love and grief rather than malicious intent, creating circumstances that seemed to require treatment rather than punishment. The community's response to the revelation of the Hartwell family's secret was one of shock and horror, mixed with sympathy for the grief that had motivated their actions and concern about how such a situation could have continued for so long without detection. Neighbors who had accepted the family's explanations about Michael's illness felt betrayed and disturbed by their unwitting participation in maintaining a deception that had enabled such profound dysfunction. The case became a landmark in the study of complicated grief and family psychology, providing insights into the mechanisms by which normal mourning could be transformed into pathological denial that persisted for years. The Hartwell family's ability to maintain their delusion while continuing to function within their community demonstrated the power of shared belief systems and the difficulty of detecting mental illness when it was concealed behind facades of normal behavior. The house at 42 Maple Street was eventually sold and demolished, with local authorities determining that the building itself had been so thoroughly contaminated by the chemical preservation agents used in Michael's room that remediation would be impractical. The site was converted to a small park dedicated to children's mental health awareness, serving as a quiet memorial to a family destroyed by love that could not accept loss. As our investigation concludes with this heartbreaking tale of grief, transformed into horror, we must reflect on the fine line between devotion and delusion, and the ways in which the deepest love can sometimes lead to the most profound forms of harm. If these revelations about the extremes of parental grief compel you to consider the importance of accepting loss and seeking help during the darkest moments of human experience, please consider leaving a like and subscribing for more explorations into the complex psychology of family relationships and the prices we pay for refusing to face difficult truths. The long-term consequences for the surviving family members varied dramatically in their outcomes and demonstrated the different ways in which shared trauma could affect individual recovery and psychological development. Thomas Hartwell never recovered from the loss of his delusion about Michael's survival, spending the remainder of his life in psychiatric facilities where he continued to insist that his son was alive and needed his care. His inability to accept reality persisted despite years of therapy and medication, suggesting that his psychological investment in the fantasy had become so complete that abandoning it would have required surrendering his entire sense of identity and purpose. Margaret's recovery was more complex, involving periods of apparent progress followed by relapses into the delusional thinking that had characterized her behavior during the 4 years of Michael's preservation. She gradually developed insight into the unreality of her beliefs about her son's survival, but this acknowledgement came at the cost of severe depression and guilt that required extensive treatment and never fully resolved. Her final years were marked by profound remorse for the harm she had caused to Sarah and by persistent questions about whether different choices might have led to healthier outcomes for her family. Sarah's rehabilitation proved to be the most successful, though her recovery required years of intensive therapy designed to help her distinguish between reality and the fantasy world that had been imposed upon her during her crucial teenage years. Her ability to eventually lead a relatively normal life was attributed to her youth at the time of the trauma and her underlying awareness that her parents' behavior was abnormal, even when she felt compelled to participate in their delusions. The psychiatric community's study of the Hartwell case contributed to development of new therapeutic approaches for families dealing with complicated grief and shared delusional disorders. The case demonstrated the importance of early intervention when normal mourning processes became disrupted, and the need for community support systems that could detect and address isolation that might enable pathological responses to loss. The medical profession also learned important lessons about the need for follow-up care in cases involving sudden childhood death, recognizing that families who withdrew from professional support might be at risk for developing unhealthy coping mechanisms that could persist for years without detection. The case influenced protocols for death notification and family counseling that were designed to prevent similar tragedies through early identification and intervention. Legal scholars who studied the case noted the challenges it presented for existing frameworks of criminal justice, as the family's actions clearly violated multiple laws while being motivated by grief and mental illness rather than criminal intent. The case contributed to discussions about appropriate responses to crimes committed by individuals whose mental state compromised their understanding of right and wrong and the balance between punishment and treatment in such circumstances. The broader implications of the case for understanding family dynamics and psychological resilience continued to influence research into the factors that determined whether families experiencing traumatic loss would develop healthy coping mechanisms or descend into pathological responses that could persist for years. The Hartwell family's tragedy demonstrated how protective factors such as social support and professional intervention could be undermined by isolation and shared reinforcement of unhealthy beliefs. The story of the family who lived with a corpse serves as a reminder that love, no matter how deep and genuine, can become a destructive force when it refuses to accept the boundaries imposed by reality and mortality. The Hartwell parents' devotion to their son was real and profound, but their inability to accept his death transformed their love into something that ultimately caused more harm than the loss they were trying to deny. Their case illustrates the importance of accepting help during times of overwhelming grief and the dangers that arise when families become isolated from the support systems that might guide them through the normal processes of mourning and healing. The 4 years that Thomas and Margaret spent caring for their dead son represented not a touching example of parental devotion, but a tragic demonstration of how the refusal to face difficult truths can destroy the very relationships that such refusal claims to protect. In the end, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Hartwell tragedy is not the macabre nature of their secret, but the recognition that their actions were motivated by the same parental love that drives healthy families to protect and nurture their children. Their descent into delusion began with the most natural and understandable of human responses, the refusal to accept that a beloved child was gone forever, and evolved through small steps into something that challenged every assumption about the boundaries between care and harm. The lesson of their story may be that the greatest threats to family welfare often come not from external dangers, but from internal dynamics that transform virtues into pathologies when they operate without the corrective influence of community, professional guidance, and honest acknowledgement of painful realities. The Hartwell family's love for Michael was never in question, but their expression of that love ultimately became a prison that trapped them all in a nightmare from which only the painful acceptance of truth could provide escape. The shocking case of the family who called a corpse their son reminds us that the line between devotion and delusion is thinner than we might imagine, and that the preservation of love sometimes requires the courage to let go of those we cannot bear to lose. Their story serves as both a tragedy and a warning about the prices we pay when we choose comfortable lies over difficult truths, and the importance of seeking help when the weight of loss threatens to crush our capacity for rational thought and healthy relationships.